Good afternoon and welcome to week 5. This week we'll be focusing on literature written post 1945. So as you read this week, or as you read the historical introduction in your textbook, I want you to apply the information that you're reading from the historical introduction last week to the information that you're reading this week. So for example, I want you to think about how the U.S. has changed during World War II. So when we think about World War II, we know that it began in 1939 and ended in 1945, but the U.S. participation actually began in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we think all of the time period from 1965 up until 1941, we know that the U.S. experienced some major changes. When we think about 1941 to 1945, these changes were actually, permanent and really becoming established. So some of these changes that I referred to, when we think about industry, the U.S. has now become a globalized powerhouse, which has an influx on consumerism. We think about the roles of women. During this time period, the roles of women are steadily changing. In particular, during 1941 to 1945, when so many men are going off of war, we see a major influx with women working in industry. People are now moving out of the cities and creating developments on farmlands that we know today as suburbs. So now we're seeing more and more people moving out of the city and into and creating developments known as suburbs. Like we talked about in previous chapters with migration and immigration tendencies. So now we're seeing, this establishment of these cultures that have come over from Europe and have populated the majority of the East Coast. We're seeing these cities that have been established as a result of migrating west. So we're also seeing a continued migration to the west. We're seeing a new understanding or a new conceptualization of the urban space as a result of so many African Americans moving from the south to the north as a result of the first Great Migration and this second Great Migration that takes place during this time period. We also are seeing a huge increase in mass media culture as well. So considering all of these things, I want you to apply that to your reading and understanding of postmodernism. So when we think about postmodernism, we want to say that a lot of these things, these changes that took place during the modern era, either went to a larger or more rapid rate, or we were deconstructing previous notions held about certain things or certain institutions. So for example, when we think about the philosophical concept of postmodernism, we want to think about this idea of an objective truth. One of the philosophers that come during this time period is French philosopher and literary critic Michel Foucault, who basically created this idea or this concept that truth was nothing but individual perception. So it became all about the understanding of self. So, going back to this understanding of self, we understood ourselves in relationship to where we lived and the social, cultural environment, I should say, and where we lived. And we started to deconstruct our previously held ideological notions about these institutions. So, for example, our concept of race changed during this time period of postmodernism. Now, race was not a thing, but rather a social construction. Same thing about gender. We couldn't say that gender was this thing and that men had these roles and women had these roles, but now we were challenging the concepts behind these roles, and now gender became a social construction, and our characteristics of male and femaleness were becoming much more fluid. Our concept of the traditional family has changed. So now when we think about that period between 1941 and 1945, when so many women were going into the workforce, that had a lasting effect. That affected our cultural landscape in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, up into contemporary times. We also questioned collective concepts of morale. So we were challenging these concepts of what it meant to be good, what it meant to be evil. We also see an even larger influx of mass media and consumerism during this time that we still see the ramifications of that to this day. So going back to this idea of postmodernism in relationship to modernism, when we think about modernism, we're thinking about this time, like I said before, when we think about postmodernism, it has its influence from World War II. We want to think about 1941 through 1945, and then we're going to slowly make this shift into postmodernism, especially in the 1960s, and we see that postmodernistic postmodernist concepts and views prevailed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and some critics argue that we see a change from postmodernism to what's been described as postmodernism as a result of September 11th. So a lot of historians, a lot of philosophers have said that our society has changed, or we are now living in this postmodern society as a result of the impact of September 11th in 2001. So these are some of the things I want you guys to think about as you're reading the authors this week. So some of the major concepts of modernism and postmodernism, and I will have, I also am sending you guys a short 5-minute YouTube clip on these two concepts to kind of give you guys, get the brain juices flowing about what you're reading. Now, in relationship to Facebook and the American Identities page this week, I want you guys to briefly write about an author, a story, or a poem that has made an impact on you this week. And I'll be looking at what you guys are writing and continuing to give you guys feedback on the things that you guys have discussed last week.